Every story in this podcast series asks, who gets to decide who belongs? Sometimes the answer is written in a will. Sometimes it is whispered in a letter. And sometimes it is hidden in the timing of things that look ordinary until you place them side by side. This episode opens with a doctor, Dr. Omar Alpha Flint. The name Alpha is not decorative. It is not poetic. It is not casual. For a man born in 1843 to carry the name Alpha was to carry expectation. Names in that era were not chosen lightly, especially among families that valued order, education, and profession. Alpha suggests origin. It suggests authority. It suggests someone meant to stand at the front of a line, not merely occupy a place within it. Omar Alpha Flint lived his life in alignment with that implication. He became a physician. He practiced medicine through decades of change. He married, he raised children, he buried a wife, and he continued forward. His life was marked by structure, continuity, and professional standing. He belonged to a class of men who understood legacy not as something emotional, but as something arranged. Alpha, in that context, is not about dominance. It is about sequence, the first decision, the first authority, the foundation upon which others build. Because Alpha does not pass his name forward to our foster child during his lifetime. It is passed after his death. The child who eventually carries the Flint name does not receive it while Alpha is alive. He does not receive it through birthright or acknowledgement. He receives it through court-ordered timing that resets the clock. That is not accidental. In this era, names are often assigned only after risk has passed, identity waiting until authority has settled. It is another moment in our story where we seemingly have to wait for death in order to hear the rest of the story. On January 24th, 1906, Omar Alpha Flint married Mary Jane Elizabeth Ahir. He was 62. She was 31. Those numbers deserve to be spoken plainly, without judgment. In stories like this, age is not romance. Age is context. By the time Dr. Omar Alpha Flint married Mary Jane Ahir, his life was already formed. He had buried parents. He had buried a wife. He had raised at least one other child. His career was established. His place in the world was settled. There were very few things left that could surprise him. Mary Jane arrived with a different history. She was born in Quebec. She had lost siblings. She had lost parents. By her early 30s, she had already learned that stability was not guaranteed, and that survival often required movement, sometimes adaptation, sometimes adoption. She crossed borders. She endured. This marriage was not the merging of two beginnings. It was the intersection of an ending and the continuation of a family name. Late-life marriages like this were not uncommon among professional men of the era. They were practical. They offered companionship. They offered care. They offered continuity. But they also came with imbalance. One partner carried authority. The other carried adaptability. That imbalance does not imply exploitation. It implies asymmetry, and asymmetry shapes decisions. Mary Jane entered a household where rules already existed, where reputations were already established, where names carried weight. She did not create that system. She married into it, and over time she learned how it functioned, where it was rigid and where it could bend. When a child enters this picture years later, that context matters. Because whatever choices Mary Jane would eventually make were not made in a vacuum. They were made inside a structure built long before her arrival, under the shadow of a man whose name meant first, whose life meant order, and whose death would quietly transfer authority into her hands. This marriage is not a footnote, it is the frame. 9 years after their marriage, on February 19th, 1915, Omar Alpha Flint died at 71. On May 18th, 1915, Mary Jane Flint is named executrix of Alpha's last will and testament nearly 3 months after his passing. The document asserting this fact in probate court is interesting, arguably for its mundanity, but also for the foreshadowing of Irene Moore's more noteworthy will. It reads in part, "To render a true account until your trust is fulfilled, and within 3 months to cause notice of your appointment to be posted in 2 public places, or published once each week for 3 weeks in the Lowell Courier-Citizen, a newspaper published in Lowell." What sounds bureaucratic to a modern ear was, in the early 1900s, one of the most important safeguards in the probate process. At that time, estates were not administered quietly behind closed doors. There were no centralized digital records, no instant credit checks, no searchable court dockets. If someone died with property, money, or obligations, the law assumed there might be people out there who needed to know, and might never find out unless the court forced the information into the open. That is why the language mattered. The publication requirement was even more critical. Posting a notice once a week for 3 consecutive weeks was not a formality. It was the early 20th century equivalent of a public broadcast. Silence after the notice mattered. If no one came forward within the prescribed window, the court took that as evidence the executor could proceed without fear of hidden claims. The estate moved forward under the assumption of consensus, or at least acquiescence. But that assumption was fragile, because once time passes, once assets are distributed, once trusts are funded and decisions become embedded, any challenge that surfaces later does not just question the will. It questions the process. It asks whether notice was truly effective, whether the right people were listening, and whether silence was consent or simply absence. This is where the seeds of later conflict are often planted. What begins as a routine notice in a local paper can, years later, become a focal point in a contested will. What happens when someone appears after the machinery of probate has already done its work? Public notice was realistically designed to create finality. Ironically, it sometimes did the opposite. It laid the groundwork for disputes that would only fully emerge once the money, the trust, and the stakes were far too large to ignore. The dates matter, because years earlier, on July 14, 1911, a child was born, a boy named Foster. At birth, he carries the genetic code of another man, a respected physician, a man whose absence we have already begun to understand. For 7 years, that child lives with the family name of his mother. Then, on May 22, 1918, something changes. His name changes. He becomes Foster Wayne Flint. He takes the last name of a man who is already dead. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and the circumstances surrounding William Stoughton cannot be ignored. With his daughter, Ruth Stoughton, already out of the house, and before his wife, Mary, would die later that same year, the foster child was placed in another home. Just before his 7th birthday, he is adopted into the Flint family by a widow, Mary Jane Ahers. This is the next rearranging of care and responsibility for our foster child. This is not a coincidence. It is the sequence. In the Flint family, the name followed, authority transferred quietly. Children inherit identity only when the timing makes it safe. Within the records I have from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, probate court is another key find. It shows that Mary J. Flint of Draycote, Massachusetts, a widow, successfully petitioned the court to adopt Foster Wayne Lyon in the county of Middlesex. Foster was born on July 14, 1911. The adoption was finalized on May 22, 1918. This record effectively erased the connection between the Stoughtons and the Lyons momentarily and ironically established one posthumously to the Flints. Charles McIntyre, first judge of probate court, signed the document. It is, to be certain, his name, but the signature does not carry the confidence or the flourish you might expect. Not feeble enough to suggest duress, but not bold enough to suggest pride. A softer constitution was being created. A new voice was being established. At 7 years old, Mary Jane Flint erased a history that would reemerge more than 30 years later. Now that the deck is square and almost all the players are in place, it is time in our next episode to delve deeper into more stories about our foster child.